Ben, thank you very much for joining me in UK Column Studio number 2. So this is a special afternoon for us, but place is not totally complete yet, but it's looking interesting.
Yes, it's great to be here.
Good.
It's nice to finally be in a proper studio too.
I know we've been talking about this for quite a long time, and there was some debate about how it should be set up. Obviously, in the footage we are going to record, the video we're going to record this afternoon, the audience will see a little bit of how it looks, but there's still quite a bit of tidying to do, a little bit more to be done to assist the audio. But I think it's going to give us the opportunity for some different styles. Both of us are sitting here very relaxed today. No doubt I will be told off because I haven't got a tie on. So we can be relaxed. We can do more spontaneous discussions, whether it's you and me or other members of the UK column team. And I think this is going to be very nice. We've got the formality of the Plymouth Hoe backdrop in the main studio, which everybody likes. And this one, more relaxed, a little bit funky. Am I allowed to use that word? It might be old-fashioned now.
It's already happened.
And yeah, I think it's going to go well.
Yeah, it's going to be great.
And we're allowed a cup of tea.
And we're allowed a cup of tea in here, yes.
So we thought we would discuss with our audience a little bit about cities and what is going to be happening with cities. And we're prompted to do this because a little while ago, a little magazine popped through my door at least. I need my glasses on to read this. And there was a little article and it said, Plymouth expansion plans, have your say. The plans for a large part of the South Hams to be swallowed up in a greater Plymouth. Now, I'll just say for the audience who don't know, to the eastern side of Plymouth, the district council area along the coastal belt is called South Hams. I live in that area. And that is one of the ones which Plymouth is going to take over, they say, swallowed up to form a greater Plymouth. And they are going to have a debate about, well, no, they're not going to have a debate about it. They're going to consult the public about their plans on Wednesday evening. So I'm going to be going along to a church hall to hear what they have to say. Plymouth City Council's already qualified the meeting by saying that there isn't really any debate because the government has said these changes to local authorities are going to happen. So I'm going to be very interested to see what the Plymouth City Council team have to say. And I've already seen online in their general blurb that they are saying it's not a power grab and there's not going to be huge changes simply because they've got control over all of this beautiful countryside. And probably I'd like to say to the audience straight away, I'm not sure I believe them. But that's the thing. Wednesday evening, I'm going to get the opportunity to be absolutely on the shop floor as a city, and Plymouth is the major city in the southwest, short of Bristol anyway. Plymouth is going to be talking about expanding into the countryside areas around Plymouth. And why don't I just list the areas they're going to be looking at? Sparkwell, Cornwood, Harford, Ugborough, Ivy Bridge, Yelton, Ermington. So those are the local areas. They're all village areas largely, with the exception of Ivy Bridge, which was a village originally, but it had a huge expansion in the very early 2000s, probably a bit before that, late 1990s. It was growing incredibly quickly, so there's a lot of new houses. So it's a bit more of an urban area, but there's a lot of countryside. Would you trust Plymouth when they say it's not a power grab?
I don't trust any political bodies or administrative bodies of the state.
Yeah.
About anything that they say on any topic, Brian. So no, I don't trust Plymouth Council when they say it's not a power grab.
I thought you'd probably say that. We had a little bit of interesting research going on a while ago, because you are very keen on paper and drawing pictures of diagrams of how you see the system. And that was certainly something that I used to do.
Mm.
But you'd been working and looking at quite, well, probably at the highest level, because if I remember correctly, on your diagrams, you were definitely into things like the United Nations and the World Economic Forum and some of these other big political bodies. But what you were demonstrating was that you could see their policy influence coming right down to city, street level.
Yes.
And in one of your diagrams, you said to me, and down here in Plymouth, we've got all these funny organisations. And one of them was called Octopus, if I remember correctly.
Plymouth Octopus.
Plymouth Octopus.
Yeah.
And I said that's funny because when I was researching back in 2005, I had also been drawing some diagrams where I came across these funny little organisations, of which Octopus was one. We had
Zebra Collective.
We had one called Eye Contact. And I was always fascinated by these little organisations, where they'd come from and what they were actually doing. And it's been the discussions with you that's really started to fill in some big holes, because these huge changes to our cities and county councils and district councils, these are not small local plans that are unfolding. This is big stuff.
This is, well, the local level is where the shovels meet the ground, basically. You know, if all of the policy stays up in the stratosphere internationally, in the UN and the World Economic Forum, then it doesn't actually have any impact. It has to ground itself in a local area in order for change to actually take place. And so I've spent a lot of time looking at, well, first of all, for me, trying to understand the UN system and what it was doing, because actually until I started working at UK Column, I'd never even really encountered the UN system. I knew that the UN existed. I knew that politicians went along to New York and sat in the UN building, and obviously you'd see the Security Council on the news, and all the kind of the basic functions of what the UN publicly communicates. You would hear about it, right? But I had no idea really that it was this huge international network and all of the different bodies that it encompasses, and the agenda it's set for itself, basically, which is an agenda of total wholesale global transformation. I'd never really understood that, because professionally I'd always been more on the market side of things.
Just qualify that, Ben. When you say professionally, you're referring back to your time with a consultancy, Ernst & Young.
Well, not just Ernst & Young. So I worked in the consulting industry, and was advising companies, mainly bits of government work, but mainly working with brands and international corporations to help them improve their performance, I guess would be a very short way of describing it. And then latterly, a lot of that was to do with using new technologies. So this process of digitization that the whole of society's been going through for the past, IBM's actually around for now. Yeah. Exactly, they buy it online now. So you end up with, a few very small, not very small, a small number of very large dominant players in areas of the economic system where you used to have huge diversity, and the high street's a really good example of that. And that's been particularly, and it's particularly important for the way that this transformation of cities and transformation of governance is playing out, because in the vacuum that's been created, the physical vacuum, literally, we've got empty shops everywhere. You've now got these new types of organizations, social enterprise a lot, or community interest company. Yeah. And these organizations are now filling up those those spaces actually, and that's it sort of presented as this sort of nice, friendly, organic progression of the way that society is structured and how it's run. But actually, when you go and look at what's driving that and where the money is coming into that system in order to enable it, and how it links directly to UN policy in particular, then you can begin to understand how that top level bit of the system, which to most people feels very sort of abstract
Distant.
and distant and democratically unaccountable, and we never vote. We don't vote for people to go to the UN. We don't any of these sort of supranational bodies. No one voted for Ursula von der Leyen, but apparently she's she's running Europe at the moment. No one voted for Antonio on behalf of the whole of humanity, right? And the things that they talk about are so kind of sort of lofty and theoretical.
A lot of people would say it's nonsense. They hear the language
Yeah, it
that
sounds
they
like
use.
nonsense. Yeah,
They can hear them talking about ideas and things they're doing. And a lot of people will often say, "Oh, this is just nonsense."
yes,
And I find this quite frustrating, because you sense that people without any understanding of what these individuals are doing or planning.
yeah. The
Us.
whole of our society.
Yeah.
And it's literally the physical environment in your town. We talk about Plymouth. You walk down Union Street in Plymouth now. There are buildings along that stretch that are part of redevelopment programs directly aligned to United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Yeah. And that's just in Plymouth. This is going on in every major town around the UK.
Yeah. As you said, Union Street, I thought let's describe that a bit for our viewers and listeners. It's quite an interesting little bit of Plymouth history, but originally when Plymouth developed as a port, the first port development was in Devonport, which is the area to the west of what is now the main city of Plymouth. And the Devonport Naval Base is on the River Tamar, to the west side of the city, southwest side of the city. And in days gone by, that was the predominant area, because obviously ships came in and that's where cargoes were landed, and that's how the trade built up. And it was only when the expansion started that Plymouth as a city began to grow. And the other thing that happened was that Plympton, which is an area to the northeast of the city, which until about 100 years ago, 150 years ago, did have a just navigable river. So that actually formed, if my memory serves me right, one of the Stannery ports. So you did have another port area to the eastern side of Plymouth, but when the river silted up, the strength of that side of the city reduced, and most of the maritime side went to the Devonport side. And Devonport was connected to Plymouth by one street, which was Union Street. And originally that street was a very busy hub of everything, so it had shops. But in later years, because in particular of the number of sailors who were ashore from a very big military base, naval base in Plymouth, that street was full of pubs and clubs.
And music halls.
And it was a very, very lively environment.
Yeah.
And I found it very sad to see these parts of Plymouth absolutely fall into disrepair. And I know that you're thinking of one particular building down that direction, which should be an absolutely phenomenal Victorian theatre, but is in fact sitting there as a derelict building.
Yeah, right.
So we've seen
it's a whole strip. It's probably about the main bit is about 200 meters of what you can still see used to be real Victorian grandeur, actually. But with a kind of burlesque sort of edge to it as well, actually, like these ornate buildings, and
Yeah.
you can kind of sense the life that would have been pulsing through that place, right, when it was an entertainment destination for the poor, and a cultural destination, and it's clearly just sort of been left to rot over
Yeah.
decades.
Yeah. This becomes very interesting for me because my time in Plymouth, I have watched the decline of the city, and so you had the basic neglect of areas. You had the demise of the naval base. So from being a huge employer, just after the Second World War, I think there was about 55,000 people employed just in the dockyard alone, and then Plymouth had inside the city and on the city periphery a lot of industry and small businesses, often connected to the dockyard. So a lot of business and industry in Plymouth. Dockyard starts to reduce, and then you saw these companies disappear one by one on the periphery of Plymouth. And you say, well, how are people going to earn their money? Then when we ended up with, in the Devonport area, so that naval base area, a large part of the community unemployed, and some of them have been unemployed for 3 generations. But what we saw Plymouth City Council start to do was regeneration projects. And this is where I got interested, because these weren't homegrown regeneration projects. They were all regeneration projects which were either funded by or themselves targeting European regeneration grant money from the European Investment Bank, from the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development.
Yeah.
And then what you started to see happen was a style of regeneration which, to my mind, completely destroyed the historical look of the city. So streets were going to be pedestrianised. They were going to be paved over in a particular way. A certain style of street furniture, lampposts and benches and bollards, would come in. And that was very quickly followed by the fact that a shopping area had a very high percentage of charity shops, or the same shops. And I was interested to see that happen in Plymouth, but at the same time I could travel to another city. I could go to Liverpool or Sheffield or Manchester and see exactly the same style of regeneration. And what it actually did is gave a uniform look to the cities, and they became slightly un-British. Sometimes the architecture, you'd say, yeah, this looks a bit like you might see it on the continent. And very often attractive but slightly dilapidated buildings were disappearing to be replaced by very unattractive modern concrete structures. And I was always very interested in that process.
Right. Well, yeah, the all of the personality was being stripped out of the country. And I remember this so this is pre-financial crash. So I think while I was at university, or just after I graduated from university, so I graduated in 2004, I remember Nottingham, which was my hometown, bits of it were completely transformed. So like areas of the Lace Market, which was all beautiful old Victorian buildings, were being taken down, and they were putting up these new flats, and they were concrete, but also a lot of glass. There were these sort of new glass and sort of ugly, boxy, nondescript modern new build apartments with some retail underneath them. And as you say, it was the same look that you were getting in Nottingham as you were getting in Plymouth or any other bit of the country, basically. So actually the personality and character of the place, and like local materials, for example, which is
sucked out.
Yeah, it just wasn't there anymore.
Yeah.
And you referenced the EU money, which is interesting, right? And the fact that a lot of this is grant based, right? And to me, this is deliberate disruption from the bureaucratic centre in order to essentially reset the social and the economic and the cultural structures in towns around the UK. And this was happening across the whole of Europe as well, right? It's not just in this country, it's been happening everywhere. And basically creating a false economy because our industrial capacity had been wound down over decades. You know, so if you go to Nottingham, for example, I just mentioned the lace market, the wealth of Nottingham through the 17 and the 1800s came from lace. Yeah. So that's no longer made in Nottingham, but a lot of the built physical infrastructure and the wealth and heritage of the town is tied up with that, but they haven't made lace there industrially in probably a couple of hundred years now. Yeah. You know, and there are other things that have happened there in terms of industrial output. So Boots was a big employer in the city, but a lot of that has been sent overseas now. And, you know, to cover over the cracks in the decline in our wealth creating capacity as a nation, you have these slugs, huge slugs, billions of euros coming in from these grant systems to give people employment. But in order to do what? To tear down
their own
infrastructure, you know, which should have been maintained.
Yeah. Aside from watching this in the city, the other thing I started to be able to see is the documents that the local authority and also some of the government agencies, the Government Office of the Southwest of England Regeneration Agencies. So these are government constructs, how the government would be helping local businesses grow, I don't know. But so these agencies came along and predominantly they then followed the requirements of the sources of the funding. So if you were going to take EBRD, European Bank of Reconstruction and Development grants, for you to get that money, you would have to agree that in your plans you were going to do X, Y, and Z, which is what the bank wanted. And so through the money, they controlled the type of development, the style of it. And essentially that's when I started to see the European purse holding cities in this country to account, because the focus of the city areas instantly went away from national government to the European Union, because the European Union was dangling all the pots of money. It was really interesting to watch.
Right. But which is a total manipulation of the economic system, basically.
Yeah. So I say, so at that time, everything I was watching happen for me was linking back to the European Union. But now we've moved on because we've got other things which have sort of come to the surface. And Mark Anderson, who is with us at the UK columns, often talking about the rise of the global cities and the global mayor system. And so it was later that I started to realise that, okay, what the European Union was building and destroying was all on the path to a much bigger control coming in. And that's really dovetails with what you started to say just now, Ben, that people sense that there's something higher than them. There's power being enacted, but they can't see that so easily. Now, some of that is breaking surface, isn't it? Because we can look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We can see their documentation and what it's talking about. We can have a look at websites which are talking about the global city and the global mayor system. And the overwhelming model coming through is that they are creating city-states of immense power.
Yes. Which are not independent city-states, which is how they're being positioned. So this drive towards this metro mayor system, which is already happening, by the way, right? So one of the most important things for people to take away from this, I think, right, is that they've actually already doing this. There's no proper consultation about it at all. The system's already in place. They are implementing it, and they're effectively bulldozing the existing system out of the way with almost no discussion at all. And it's just happening. Right. And they've lined up every single component part of the system in order for them to enable that transition ultimately. And they talk about it as a transition, a great global transition. And it's not just political system, it's the whole economic system, it's the energy grid, it's the telecommunications infrastructure, the internet, it's the artificial intelligence platforms that they're developing that are going to be absolutely core to this governance. And it's basically a replatforming of everything everywhere to a single integrated system that is consistent across the whole world. And the mayors is how it's being implemented, and they allow devolution to the level of mayor because it gives people the sense, the false hope ultimately that there is some accountability, or that you can exert a little bit of control and have some democratic representation because there's someone from your local area who you can at least vote for, and that might help you to exert some influence over the system, right? But actually, that's not what they're for. Like, so this devolution to this mayor-based system is actually they're little fiefdoms.
Yeah,
it's like a franchise model. It's probably a really good way of describing it, right? It's like every restaurant that you can go into is now a McDonald's. It might have different people behind the counter, and the manager might be a different person from one to the next, but ultimately they're all just McDonald's. Yeah, and that's basically the model that they're moving towards. And actually, they learnt the lessons of global corporatization of industry. They've actually learnt a lot of stuff from the way that these big international companies have run, and then deployed it back into the political system.
yeah.
Yeah.
This is fascinating, and for me, this is where people need to pay attention because, as you say, this bit is being put in place very quickly. So they've built a new system of governance. Just reminds people of what they had. We had parish councils, so representation down to the smallest village or hamlet. Just a few people in the parish. And of course, that's also connected to the churches. Parish is usually regarded as the area connected to a particular church.
Yes.
We had the district councils, which were locally based, not even at community level. They were geographic areas within a county. So they're a division of the county level. And then, yes, it was sensible, I would agree, that when you had the bigger cities forming, they obviously needed to become a unit in their own right. So then we had Plymouth City Council and Manchester City Council and Greater London Council as it was. So that made sense. But nevertheless, that was a system where you had a breakdown in levels. And you knew if you were at the bottom of the chain, you were always dealing with somebody bigger but still local in order to represent you. Now, what's been built on the side, to one side, a parallel system, is nothing to do with that at all. And this is where people really got to pay attention, because we've got district councils have gone. A lot of that happened after lockdown, because during lockdown, a lot of the district councils simply abandoned their businesses and said you can work from home. And then once COVID was over, people never went back to work in the district councils. And so now that's being used as an excuse that we don't really need the district councils and we're going to get rid of them. So there's a grouping up of the county structure, whilst at the same time we're building these city-states, fiefdoms. Is what they are. And the other person of power in them, of course, is the police commissioner.
Yes.
Who was introduced as a person who the public could trust to regulate the police because they elected them. but everywhere I've come across police commissioners, they're actually working hand in glove with the police and the local authorities themselves. So
certainly are, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and we've talked about this particularly in relation to Greater Manchester and a lot of the issues around investigations and into and accountability for grooming gangs issue and what's been going on in Oldham and Rotherham, and it's been a pack
yeah,
of trouble. And we're not
yeah,
here to talk about that necessarily,
no,
right? But ultimately, these things are all interlinked with each
yeah,
other. And if that's an exemplar of how this thing's going to
yeah,
operate, then I think it's fairly damning, I would say.
yeah. So your city franchise idea, this is brilliant because this really brings it home. You're going to be in a city, so you'll drive along the road and you'll come to a sign and it will say you're entering Manchester or Newcastle, and you think you've entered a different city, but actually the whole structure is going to be franchise model, and it will be exactly the same as Glasgow or Manchester or Sheffield or Leeds, wherever it is.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and it'll all be running on the same governance, the same
yeah,
technological systems. Everything will be integrated in the background.
yeah.
They'll have the same surveillance technologies. They're driving people towards urbanisation because they want people to be. This is part of this idea of inclusivity, right? They don't want anyone living outside of the system. That's what
Yeah,
inclusive
yeah.
means. It means that you can only exist within the system that they're
So the
developing,
level of every man, woman, and child has,
alive on Earth. Yes,
yeah,
exactly. Because this is not just happening in the UK; it's happening everywhere. So we've
yeah,
talked about this global mares. C40 mares is one of the sort of leading examples of this. Sadiq Khan is the co-president alongside a woman, forget her name, from Sierra Leone, I believe it is, right?
yes,
So you've got these kind of diverse groups, internationalist, promoting the same agenda, running on the same platform, same
yeah,
technology, the same system ultimately, which is alien to the nation state.
and national cultures.
It is essentially anti-nationalist, right? And this is a globalized system. Um, and you can see this manifesting in right down to the level of you want to know why they're not paving the roads properly out in the counties. It's because they want to make those areas unlivable so that people leave them, won't live there, and they'll move into the urban centres where
Yeah,
all of the investment is being put.
yeah,
Right, we hear a lot. One of these issues that people get quite upset about is potholes in the roads. Well, that's not a mistake. That's a deliberate move to drive people, nudge people
yeah,
towards urban centres and the new system, which is where the cities is where this new system is focused on
yeah.
ultimately.
Now, before it goes out of my mind, just coming back to Plymouth specifically, when you read the blurb from Plymouth City Council about these new plans, one of the things they said is that, well, first of all, they emphasised that Plymouth was an important global city. This always makes me smile because Plymouth has trouble operating as a city in UK, but apparently is an important global city. And also that Plymouth feels that it needs to increase its population to 300,000. Now, I can imagine for other city dwellers across UK, they're going to be thinking, well, that's not much. But Plymouth has just about held its own as a city with a population, I think, around about 230, 240,000. I think it's up to about 250,000 now. So they are proposing another 50,000, let's say another 50,000 people coming into Plymouth. Where are they going to work? Where are they going to live? Well, we know what's going to happen with the living problem because just outside of Plymouth, they decided to create a new town called Sherford. It's on green fields. And although the excuse used was that it was low-grade agricultural space, since we can't feed ourselves as a nation, perhaps we ought to be very careful of what we designate low-grade agricultural space. But they built a new city or a big new housing development with no new link to the main highway. So the M5 A38 coming down into Plymouth. There is no new junction to take you into this vast new urban area. There are virtually no shops. They have got a school there now, I think. But you just drive into this slightly, to me, spooky urban area, which is, there are some nice buildings, but it's all a bit uniform and it's very wide space and open.
Inorganic.
Yeah.
And they feel a bit fake.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Because actually, if you, in any city, proper cities, you know, certainly in this country and other ancient civilizations,
They
Britain
grew.
is an ancient culture, right? We've got cities that have built up over thousands of years. They build up over thousands of years, right? It's a process of development, and that takes time, and it happens in a kind of in a very natural and organic way.
Yeah.
And you know, a 50,000 person town, essentially what that is, right? We're talking about 50,000 people. Well, actually, how many people in this new?
No, I'm saying they're going to take on another 50. I'm not sure what the population of Sherford is now. It's nowhere near 50,000, but nevertheless, they've built a lot of houses.
Yes,
and it's still expanding.
Right, but it's all just come at once.
Yeah,
so it's not just something that's developed over time, incrementally over decades. It's just lump it in.
But when they went to develop it, it was, we had to have it. We need it. We need all this space for new homes. And they never said where people were coming from.
Yes.
But now, of course, we get a little bit of a clue, because if we dip our toes into a delicate area, any place around UK can now see that a significant proportion of the population is coming in with migration.
Yeah.
And that is also part of the plan to break down national identity.
Yes.
Not only in UK, but across Europe. And so so we're in here to the UN's migration plans.
Yes.
Impacting on how somewhere like Plymouth builds itself. It's
well, exactly.
It's fascinating.
No, it is fascinating, right? And yes. So, you know, another example of where the global strategy, the global plan begins to impact on the physical and the cultural space in your immediate vicinity, ultimately. Yes. And I forget the name. Was it Peter Sutherland? Was that the guy?
Yes,
the UN.
Sir Peter Sutherland.
Yeah. So was he Irish? Am I getting that right?
I think possibly he was. You might,
yeah. But he was a top UN official.
Yeah, ambassador on migration.
Right, and this was probably knocking on 20 years ago. I think he died around 2010, if I'm correct. Maybe it was more recent.
A few years ago. Yeah.
But he was basically saying that, well, we need mass migration in order to break down the nation states, and this is the direction of travel that we've taken, and that's what we're going to do.
And that's a very cruel agenda, because if people are feeling pressurised as a result of newcomers coming into the country, the people who are being displaced from their own country or leaving their own country, a lot of them are under stress themselves.
Absolutely.
And I have never forgotten driving home one night from the UK column. Very rarely listen to it now, but I had Radio 4 on. And at one point, they were talking about the fact that if you were a social worker in UK, you should seriously think about having a look for a job in Poland, because Poland was desperately short of social workers and care workers. Why? Because all the young people had migrated into Western Europe and UK, leaving the elderly people, particularly in the farming areas in Poland, with no young people to support them.
Right.
So very cruel on the elderly people in Poland, cruel on the young people that have been lured to a new nation state, thinking that the grass is greener on the other side.
Yeah.
And then we are pressurized as a result of that migration.
And it's a completely ludicrous and illogical policy.
Yeah.
Right. So the young people have come from Poland to work in jobs here, but then we've got to send people from here over to Poland to work in jobs there. why on earth would we need to do that? Why doesn't everyone just stay where they are?
Well, because
And we can
we
fill
go,
the positions that are required
we can't have happy people living in their own
in
states
our
and
own
enjoying their own culture and their own identity.
exactly.
That's all got to be broken up,
Exactly.
which is what Peter Sutherland said. We need more mass migration
Yeah.
to break down the homogeneity of the nation state.
Exactly. Which is
So-
ultimately, but it's not just it's a direct attack on the people, right? So when we talk about the nation state and why that's important, it's because it's constituted of individual human beings with lives and ambitions, and this is actually a direct attack on them.
Yeah.
Right.
So
importantly, and the mayors, they're ultimately driving this agenda now, right? So there's one example that I've been looking at for the past few days, which is the new mayor of let me get this absolutely correct. I've got it in front of me here. So this lady is Helen Godwin, and she's the mayor of the West of England Combined Authority, Bristol and associated areas around there. And she's only been in position for a couple of months. And just yesterday, I think it was. No, when did this come out? On the 18th of June. We'll provide a link to this. You can go and have a read of it. But it talks about the fact that she's going to be using a citizens' assembly.
Right.
Which is one of these democratic innovations that we've been talking about, these new democratic models. And she's going to use that to reshape culture in the West of England with a people-powered vision, apparently. So the mayor is going to micromanage culture in Bristol and Avon and that whole area. And they're talking about this as a democratic experiment which will put cultural decision-making in the hands of 52 citizens. So they're going to select.
that's the key word, isn't it? These are not elected citizens. These are going to be selected citizens.
Yes. So they've sent out letters to 15,000 households, apparently randomly chosen. Yeah. But you know, I would question how random that actually is. And if the letters going out is random, then I'm sure that there's some screening going on in the selection process. Of course there will be. And then they're going to run this series of assemblies to make decisions about culture in the Bristol region. Well, why does the mayor have anything to say about culture? Culture comes from the people. It comes from the whole population engaging in.
No, that's where it came from.
Well, it's where it used to come from.
That's where it used to come. Now we have a group of individuals who've been told cultures to change.
Yes.
And they are now starting the path to changing the culture.
Yes.
To a culture that we can suspect we know what it is. We can guess by looking at indicators.
Yes.
But ultimately, this is going to be a culture which is alien to anything that we've lived with.
Yes.
If we still have a national identity of any type.
Exactly. It's imposed. It's artificial culture. It's these decisions. They're all ultimately going to be about the allocation of tax revenue, because that's all politicians do, right? They don't actually understand anything other than how to dole out other people's money. That's literally the job that they have. And so that's interesting in its own right? But beyond that, the two other things that I think that really stood out to me about this was, first of all, this lady, Helen Godwin, has most recently, she was a counsellor in Bristol for a few years. She also worked professionally as a director at Hayes, which is a big recruitment company. But most recently, she was in the local government consulting team at PwC. She spent 3 years at PricewaterhouseCoopers, who are a strategic partner of the World Economic Forum. So they are actively engaged in the Great Reset and the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals So this is the market side. The UN represents the state ultimately, the power structure. It dictates the direction of travel, terms of engagement. But then the market, the World Economic Forum side, the corporations are engaged in the implementation of that in the profit seeking marketplace that's been constructed around this whole transformation program. So she spent 3 years doing that. So that you have to question her her motives and ultimately her mindset around this. You know, she's been put in there to change
where
things.
has she come from? How is it that she's now in this very interesting position?
Yeah,
that's the first question I'd ask.
Exactly. And then the other thing is when you look at where the money is coming in from to support this cultural transformation program.
Yeah.
And some of it's from the Arts Council, right? So again, this is central state money being pushed into transformation of city regions across the UK, but then also importantly, the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation and the Paul Hamlyn Foundation. So these supposedly philanthropic, charitable foundations who have all made it their mission to break down and reshape and reform the nation state. And these two are particularly active in the UK. I think Calouste Gulbenkian is Turkish, but I think Paul Hamlyn is based out of London. Right. So we've got international capital coming from the richest families in the world flooding into these cultural and economic and political
change agents,
change programs.
Yeah.
And this is now being presented back to the British people as a fait accompli, an inevitability.
And with the deceitful line that this is just UK government reorganisation of local government, when in fact what the government is doing is following this higher level international agenda. So there is a huge amount to discuss about this.
Yes.
Just coming back to Plymouth, we'll say to the audience that this meeting's coming up this week. I will attend. I will make sure I pay attention, and we'll see whether we can get some interesting material to run a follow-up on what was discussed in the meeting. What did Plymouth City Council say it was going to do in these expansion plans? I think we might be able to challenge them a little bit, so that'll be fun. But we've got a huge amount of material. You've done a really brilliant amount of research looking at these change agents, the bodies, the policies, the people, the funding streams. It's a vast network. It's almost like a virus descending over culture in UK.
I think it's a cancer. It's like a cancerous growth, actually, which has attached itself to the host nation and is slowly killing it. Ultimately, and that's the closest analogy I can think of.
So to deal with this disease, we need to be able to see it, recognise it for what it is.
Yeah.
We need to be having a look at what we can do to heal society in UK.
Yes.
And I think the most upbeat thing, which I could possibly end on, is the fact that when you analyse the control structure that these powers and these bodies and these funding streams are implementing, they only get control when people at the lowest level agree to be controlled. And more I see that if you have people at the local level, parish level, communities on a street, every time they say, no, we are not having this, it causes ructions further up the chain, because these powerful people have no power unless they can control the individual. That's how I see it.
It's completely true. Yeah. And actually, they have massively underestimated the fight. I think I would say that there is still in the hearts and minds of the British people, but also, internationally, they're struggling to implement this system. But I'll talk to Britain because that's where we are, and that's, my main focus. But they've also massively overestimated their own ability to implement this. You've got a lot of very arrogant people in these systems who seem to think that because they've done a good job of elevating themselves up the corrupt hierarchy, that gives them some kind of power over others, whereas actually it doesn't. And they're beginning to really understand that, I think.
Yeah,
So
I think that's true.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Ben, it's been a fascinating conversation. A little teaser for our viewers and listeners, and that is that UK Column is planning another written report along the lines of Your Life in Their Hands. We are going to specifically look at this issue of control over the nations and the city-states and some of these power systems. And I think there's a very good glossy UK column production coming, and we'll keep people informed as to the final published date. But we are working on it. You're certainly working on it, so that's good. Okay, thanks very much, Ben.
Thank you, Brian. It was a pleasure. Here's to many more in the new studio.